So welcome to the Future of Wellbeing podcast with me, Rob Stevenson. And I am delighted today to welcome James Hewitt. James, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you for
Do you want
joining
me to
us.
rate myself on
Yeah,
a
go
form
on. Yeah,
score?
go on. What's your score today? What's your score?
You know what? I noticed yours is 9 out of 10. And I'd probably say I'm about a 9 out of 10 today, actually.
Yeah,
I'm feeling pretty
mate.
good. I've got a caffeinated coffee, so I might even be a 10 out of 10 in about 20 minutes when that kicks in. So let's see.
Absolutely. Well, we'll kind of watch to see if that changes. Yeah, so I'm a 9 today because I think two reasons really, and I've had a run of 9s, which is really unusual for my form to be so high. And
Mm.
I've been seeing a new therapist, relatively new therapist. I'm into about session number 12 now over the last 12 weeks. And she's just helping me kind of show up in the world in a very different way. And what I found with that is issues that might have got sort of repressed and pushed down. I'm managing to kind of understand what's going on for me. She's really bringing some self-awareness as to what I'm feeling. So that's one
Mm.
thing. And the other thing is poetry and spoken word. I've been experimenting with this in the last few weeks. And I'm loving this kind of creative outlet outside of work to just get some thoughts down onto paper. So that's really keeping me high. So aside from your coffee, what's keeping you at a 9 out of 10?
Yeah, well, I think, the bright light and the good weather is really helping.
Yeah.
So, I live in Cambridge in the UK now, and as many people in the UK might have experienced, we've got some great weather, blue skies, and I like the good weather. I like to get out on my bike. It's been fantastic to be able to, go on some slightly longer rides, just being wearing, shorts and a jersey, getting a bit too hot. I actually quite like to get quite hot on my bike.
Yeah,
I'm sure you can relate to that, Rob.
indeed.
And so that's definitely been helping. And I've also been at home for a couple of weeks with a bit less travel, so been able to spend some real quality time with my wife, my kids, and some friends as well. So just lots of simple moments, just sitting in the garden at the end of the day, having breakfast. Our kids, we've got two sons, they're 9 and 12, and
Yeah.
they're full of loads of questions. They're so curious, and it always brings me a lot of joy just to hear all their questions. And we talk about all kinds of topics, and that's definitely been keeping the form score high over the last couple of weeks.
Fantastic. Really, really good to see. So when I came up with the concept for a podcast on the future of wellbeing, you were actually one of the first people I thought I'd love to have a chat with, just because you are a human performance scientist. Your PhD from Loughborough is in the sustainable high performance in knowledge workers. And for me, I think as we talk about future of wellbeing, that idea of well-being being a core component of performance, I think, is really important. So I'm definitely keen to get into some of that. But I want to start with your coffee, actually. And given that you are, a scientist and you put a great amount of information out there in your newsletters, your LinkedIn posts that really help educate us all with some of the interesting studies. I know you've published on caffeine and talked about caffeine previously. What's your sort of policy on caffeine, and how do you use caffeine to boost your performance?
Yeah, well, caffeine is such a fascinating topic as well as a substance, and a lot of the things that I find, are vulnerable to confirmation bias because I really enjoy coffee so much.
Yeah.
We tend to seek out things which support what we want to hear. But one of the biggest challenges with caffeine, I think, is that it does interrupt sleep. It's got a long half-life, and around 6 hours. And so some people metabolize caffeine much faster than others, but generally for me, I actually try to avoid caffeine after about 11 a.m.
Okay.
I generally say to most people, stop at midday. And that often can help people in terms of reducing the time it takes to get to sleep, even improving the quality of their sleep. And stopping at 11 or midday doesn't mean just load it all up in the morning, because that caffeine still has to be metabolized, and there'll still be enough hanging around at the end of the day if you've got that dose high enough. The other thing that I try to do is take a small amount regularly. And so for me, it's about getting caffeine in coffee generally. And the evidence seems to indicate that an optimal dose is around 0.3 milligrams per kilogram per hour. And so for me, that would mean that, like, that, which is kind of, it's got a double espresso in it, which could be 50 milligrams. I'm about 73 kilograms. That's plenty for a couple of hours for me.
Yeah.
And so it's the little and often. But the interesting thing about caffeine is that there's still quite a lot more left to be learned about it, because the effect of caffeine seems to depend quite a lot on your sleep history. So, how much you've slept in the previous nights leading up to it, one of the main cognitive performance enhancing benefits of caffeine seems to be very strongly related to helping you to offset some of the effects of sleep deprivation, as much as it is a kind of supernormal boost. So you've got to take into account that. And so for me, I think I enjoy it. I find it does help me. Perhaps maybe because sometimes I could sleep better than I do, I think, like most people. But most of it for me is about enjoyment. And a game changer for me was finding a decaf coffee blend that I actually enjoyed, and had a filtration method that didn't use any chemical solvents. And as a result of that, it's better for you and with a better flavor as well. So yeah, they're my kind of top tips and reflections on coffee and caffeine.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And I think a lot of us will kind of use caffeine as a bit of a crutch when we're feeling tired or we haven't slept well. It's interesting that that's when it might give the bigger effect. But I think interesting on the sort of decaf, there's also the placebo effect, isn't there? And across all areas of science, that's very powerful. That actually, that act of the smell and of drinking will kind of associate with that performance boost potentially, right?
Definitely, yeah. Well, there's something called the caffeine expectancy effect. And expectancy effects are a big part of the placebo effect because it relates to what we think is going to happen when we do something. And so it seems that because we've built up this expectancy that when we drink coffee we get a kind of boost, that actually even decaf coffee is associated with that expectancy and a benefit. And there's been some interesting studies on that. They've found that caffeine specifically is vulnerable to the placebo effect, in the sense that you can give someone what they think is caffeine and it does have a performance enhancing benefit. But coffee specifically is also vulnerable to the placebo effect. And they've done some quite interesting studies where they show that even decaf coffee can reduce the side effects associated with caffeine withdrawal. And so the placebo effect sometimes gets a hard time. People think it's kind of a trick or something, but in my view is that it's a way to access your brain's internal pharmacy.
Yeah.
Because that's essentially what's happening. When we experience a placebo effect, is the expectancy is actually resulting in changes in our neurophysiology that can be associated with benefits. And we talk about this for ages. There's some fascinating examples in exercise science as well, where even if people know they're getting a placebo, it can still boost their physical performance.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating area. I really love reading more about it.
Yeah, well, I think it speaks to the untapped power of the mind, right? That we don't fully understand how the mind works, but if we believe something can happen, if we have that visualization in our mind that it can happen, often you can go some way of that being a reality. I think I remember seeing you post on cold water therapy and ice baths, and which I use quite regularly to help manage my symptoms of long COVID. Now, the evidence there doesn't necessarily stack up that it's proven that it will, but I believe that it does. And then I feel very energized, and I feel like my inflammation is get down, et cetera, et cetera. And it's, I think, the untapped power of the mind, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, so obviously I tend to look at things in quite an empirical way. I describe myself as a scientist. I look at the world in quite a scientific way. And the thing we've got to be careful of with any kind of published research, though, is that the results statistically are often expressed as means, that as averages. And when you look at the data, you can see that there might be what's described as confidence intervals. So you've got that kind of average in the middle, and then you've got that spread of kind of possible responses is one way to look at it, or possible outcomes. And so when you do a piece of research looking at a particular outcome, on average, what you might find is that with a reasonable degree of confidence, you can say this doesn't work. But what you'll always find is that in those participants, among that group, there'll be people who have a really negative response or a really positive response. And so I think that with ice baths, for example, my view is that I think there is evidence that it does work. I think if we look at it empirically, the ice baths don't necessarily work better than other approaches to reducing inflammation, boosting alertness, managing stress, for example. Exercise is very effective at doing that as well. However, that doesn't mean that it's not the best for you or for someone else. because ultimately we are each an n equals 1 experiment. And so when you're looking at interventions like that, generally, my advice or my reflection for people is, if you are happy with the kind of the risk reward ratio and the cost benefit, whether that's financial cost or time or whatever, then try it. And it might be the thing that just works fantastically well for you. And it sounds like ice baths are that for you, which is great.
Yeah. And I think you make a really good point. The n equals 1 is that we're all unique where our well-being is concerned. And I think you can read all of the studies in the world, but actually you've got to try things, and you've got to go and try things that you haven't tried before to understand, are they benefiting you? So the example I always like to give on this is flotation tanks. I despise them. I can't stand them. I want to get out as soon as I'm in, even though I understand the benefits of relaxation and, kind of being in that moment and mindfulness. I just can't take them. Whereas for other people, they're game changing, right? And I think sometimes unless you try these things, you're never going to work it out.
Absolutely.
So, there's many tangents I want to go off with you already. We've talked about sleep. I want to come back to sleep, but let's just kind of reset for a second. Why are you so passionate about this? How did you kind of get into being a human performance scientist?
So I've always been interested in human performance, and I think that that spark really started very, very young. I was probably about 3 when we were living in the States at the time, in America, and I remember watching the shuttle launches. And I just became obsessed with space and astronauts and the training that astronauts needed to do. And so when we were living there, we were fortunate enough to go and visit some of the different kind of NASA sites and get to understand a bit more about what was required to train to be an astronaut, and play some of the games and simulations that you do when you're a kid. And from then on, I've always been fascinated by this question: what does it take for people to be able to reach their potential? What is human potential? And eventually that led into a sporting career. I raced bikes full time for several years, but wasn't good enough to be a really good pro. Eventually went into sports coaching, studied sports science. But the majority of the people that I worked with were knowledge workers. So they were people who thought for a living: management consultants, finance professionals, the usual suspects. And initially realized that if I couldn't account for their physical training, I couldn't account for their cognitive workload alongside their physical training, then I couldn't plan their physical training effectively. So, for example, I noticed that when people had a really stressful work week, they wouldn't respond so well to a particular training session that I set when their cognitive workload was less, when their work stress was reduced. And so initially started to try and understand that world, and found that there were some tools available in organizational psychology, but often those tools looked at the workplace at a single point in time. And as a sports scientist, you would never do that. So, if you're looking at a training program, for example, you look at the training history, what's been going on before, what they're trying to achieve. You monitor then each day, even potentially multiple times a day, to figure out what's going on. So I tried to build a model to try and understand the workplace like that, to try and understand these patterns in the people that I was working with, patterns of stress, psychological stress, recovery, eventually looking at things like sleep and HRV, and came to conceptualize knowledge work as a cognitive endurance activity in a similar way that I was thinking about cycling as a physical endurance activity. And became more curious about the workplace, if I'm honest, than I was about their physical performance. And just went down that track, and had some great opportunities along the way with some companies that I worked with, and that led to this focus on the relationship between workplace wellbeing and performance. But the underlying driver continues to be this question of, what are human beings capable of? What is their potential? How can we help them to reach that? What conditions do we need to create for people to get the best out of themselves? Not just in work, but outside of work, in life as well. And that's really what gets me out of bed in the morning. Exploring that question and trying to understand more about what we can do to support people on that path towards reaching more of their potential.
Really interesting. I haven't heard that use that term before of cognitive endurance athlete. And I think it's really interesting. And in some of my keynotes, I'll put up some images of like Roger Federer and LeBron James, and two greats in their field, and kind of make the point that one of the reasons that they're greats is because they recover from the stresses of training and competition adequately, so that they can improve and perform at their best the next time. Whereas, a corporate endurance athlete, a cognitive endurance athlete, can often go from one very stressful situation to another with limited amount of recovery and breaks and time to, to kind of grow from those stressful times, or even reflect on them and expect to perform at their best. So really interesting to hear you coin that phrase. Do you think generally people are underperforming because they're not listening to their bodies, listening to their minds, and giving themselves that sort of time to recover and time to reflect and time to sleep properly, etc., etc.?
I think that is a key challenge. So one of the advantages that we've got with sport is that the workload is relatively easy to measure.
Yeah.
And also we can quantify maximum output. So if we take cycling for example, you can quantify the physical work that a cyclist does by using something called a power meter, and you can measure watts, which is literally the mechanical work that you're doing on the bike. Yep. You can then measure the physiological mechanism which is supporting that mechanical work by measuring something like heart rate, for example. Yeah. And then you can add in something like a rating of perceived exertion, so you can figure out how hard that feels. And with that kind of model, you can very accurately quantify the work that's been done, how someone's improving over time, where their strengths and weaknesses are. But also you can do something like a VO2 max test. And then you can understand in a given moment, what percentage of that maximum are they working at. And with all those variables, essentially what you can do is to plan effort and recovery. So effort can be sustained over long periods without people experiencing what we describe technically as non-functional overreaching. Yeah. Which is kind of analogous to burnout in the workplace. The challenge with knowledge work in particular is that there often aren't clearly defined outcomes. We're not doing mechanical work. Most of the time we're managing the flows of information. Yeah. And that's because of that characteristic of knowledge work. It's also very difficult to quantify what maximum output is. So I can't just stick someone on an ergometer, a stationary bike, and gradually increase the intensity until they can't go anymore. So a lot of the time we're kind of guessing, and we end up having to use lagging indicators rather than leading indicators. So in cycling, the leading indicator, once you know that maximum output, you can say, okay, you've reached what we describe as a threshold, the point at which that effort cannot be sustained for a long period of time, just to simplify it. Whereas, and then you can back off, and you can give cyclists the tools so that they're able to look at a screen and figure out what that is. In knowledge work, most of the time, we don't have any of that kind of dashboard or those kind of indicators. So we rely on these lagging indicators, i.e. an indicator that comes after, which is, oh no, I worked too hard. And which might manifest itself as an inability to switch off from work, negative stress in the form of anxiety, for example. But I think that one of the other biggest challenges that we see in knowledge work that's distinct from endurance sport is coined as the recovery paradox. And it describes how recovery is often most difficult when it is most needed. Yeah. And so, for example, if you've worked a really long, hard day, you really need to recover. But it's often on those days that it's most difficult to wind down and switch off.
Because your mind is so activated.
That's one of the reasons, you're psychophysiologically activated. It's like all the systems have upregulated. And there's this model that I sometimes find quite helpful called the effort recovery model. And it describes how to meet work demands, we need to deploy effort. Obvious. And in meeting those work demands, there's this upregulation of what we describe as psychophysiological systems. And that's basically just a fancy way of saying that stuff upregulates, it activates, that helps us to meet those work demands. So physiologically, you'd see this secretion of what you might call stress hormones, like adrenaline, for example. But these things in and of themselves aren't a bad thing. They actually help us to tolerate that effort. But ideally what happens is that the work demands are removed, and then recovery occurs because there's this down regulation. The problem is that often we work in this always on pattern. And that was actually the focus of my PhD research, this boundaryless work where work used to end, but now what often happens is we get home, maybe we do a bit of personal stuff or with family perhaps, and then we get online again for what some people describe as the new night shift.
Mm.
So for many knowledge workers, there's no clearly structured pattern of effort and recovery or awareness of where the limit is that exists in endurance sport. Instead, we kind of just rely on this perception, which is sometimes faulty and also vulnerable to these kind of paradoxical effects like the recovery paradox.
Yeah.
So I think a big opportunity in the future of wellbeing is to provide people with tools so they've got a better idea of that balance between effort and recovery, and how they can also restore resources, which is another aspect of tolerating that effort and recovering well. But also, it's so important that we don't just put the responsibility entirely on the individual. It's also about providing employers with an understanding of how the systems that they're setting up are generating work demands, and having a very clear view of whether those demands are reasonable, whether they're even necessary, because there's a huge amount of inefficiency in many organizations, as we know. And that relates to things like job clarity, for example, which we could also talk about. But I think that was a little bit of a tangent from your question. But in terms of the analogies, the similarities between sport and business, endurance sport, sustained effort, that recovery paradox, the fact that we don't know what our maximum is, we don't know where our limit is, and we rely on these lagging indicators when things go wrong rather than being proactive, are some of the key challenges that I see in what I describe as the cognitive endurance activity of knowledge work.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And I kind of want to extend the cycling analogy a little bit in a second, but clearly there have been studies where you can measure kind of performance and output with particularly with call centers, and where there's metrics on how people are performing, and there's the BT study that shows the link between performance and well-being, which is great. As a cyclist, when you're a kind of novice cyclist, but you start getting a bit more serious, you start getting into the metrics. You probably start with heart rate, and then you might get a power meter, as you've said, and you can look at your power. But eventually, as you get more experienced, you become more capable of judging effort and knowing when you can take all the data off, but if you're pushing yourself too hard or not, particularly if you're an elite athlete, right? I'm wondering if we can help people understand their kind of pace of working and what they're putting in over time to know, okay, this is a good sustainable performance threshold for me cognitively, or actually no, I'm pushing myself too hard. And that comes with a lot of self-awareness and self-reflection, doesn't it? And I think kind of the way we're trying to tackle this with Form Score is getting people to reflect more frequently, what's my well-being today, but how effective do I feel? How committed am I to the mission of my team and my organization? And as you point out, what are the factors from a work perspective, but also a personal perspective, that are influencing that? So do you think it is possible to kind of build that kind of innate understanding of cognitive performance threshold and that self-awareness within people?
Yeah, I think it is. And there's some companies who are kind of experimenting with this already. There was a Formula One team that built a very sophisticated model that could actually predict people's cognitive performance on a subsequent day based on leading indicators. There's other commercial companies that are exploring that kind of possibility now. But I think the challenge is in making those technologies as least burdensome as possible. The problem is that often, if you really want to measure what's going on under the hood, metaphorically speaking, as in your brain, you've got to use something like EEG, so measuring the electrical activity of the brain. And there's some really nice passive sensors now that can do that. So, that even go into headphones, for example. But most people don't want to wear those all the time. There's some other really interesting technologies which can infer cognitive load and maybe cognitive performance by the way that you interact with your computer software. So, for example, things like typing speed, even mouse movements, might be able to indicate cognitive performance and cognitive load. And ideally, what you're looking for is these kind of drop-offs, these patterns which indicate that if someone, their sustained effort is starting to diminish, they're not able to sustain that effort as they were over a given period of time, which can give you this sense of whether someone might need to recover. Microsoft is also doing some really interesting research in this space, and they had a really well publicized study. It was a very small study, just with 14 people, where they used that EEG technology to highlight the importance of taking breaks between meetings, for example, which they showed improved subsequent engagement and reduced stress based on looking at brainwave frequencies. So I think that it already is possible. It's not really commercialized yet fully, even though there's potentially some opportunities to do that. And I think that could be a future possibility. You make a really interesting point there about this idea of when you first start using these measurement technologies as an athlete, you can be quite reliant on them. But ideally, over time, you train your interoception, your awareness of what's going on in your body, and you don't need them so much anymore. But that's what I see as one of the biggest risks, I think, with some of these wearable technologies, these measurement technologies, whether it's trying to understand cognitive performance or other outcomes. And that is that we can end up losing our sense of what is going on internally. There was some interesting research into this, and they described kind of 3 different possibilities in terms of how people respond to wearable data. And they describe it as datafication, economization, and individualization. And the datafication term describes people who feel controlled by the numbers and they lose touch with their intuition. This economization is a bit of a clunky word, but basically that meant that people actually found that their wearables led to stress and what the researchers described as negative self-appraisal. And so basically that's meant people evaluated themselves harshly if they didn't meet their goals. So for example, you could see that with a step count. Someone saying, oh, I'm a bad person because I didn't hit 10,000 steps or whatever is a simple example. And then there's this idea of individualization, where some people might start to rely on the external motivation associated with the data rather than this personal drive. So in the steps example, again, it might someone focuses entirely on just getting 10,000 steps rather than just recognizing that being generally more physically active is really good for their health and well-being. It's going to help them be more present and engaged in what some of these more holistic outcomes. So we've got to be aware of that. And funnily enough, I've seen it in cyclists. And I was talking to a direct sportif of a very well-known pro team not that long ago, who was actually saying that one of the challenges with young riders is that they've got to use these power meters from so early in their careers. They've completely delegated, they've outsourced their perception of effort to the power meter. And he was saying how they would never forget to go out for a training ride without the head unit, the little computer on the front of the bike. But some of them will get 5k down the road and realize they haven't put a water bottle on. And so he actually ended up implementing these rides where people didn't have any technology. They didn't have the head unit on their bike, or the head unit was covered with tape so they could still capture the data if they needed to, and got people to retrain that perception, or for some of them train for the first time that feeling of effort. So my view on the technology and wearables in the workplace is, I think we're aligned on this by the sounds of it, that ideally we want to use these tools to help people to calibrate their intuition. And so ideally then, when we're working, we've got this more natural sense of how our effort and recovery are balanced. And then ideally that perception becomes what I describe as a leading indicator. So we can start to more quickly identify when we're going over that threshold, that point where we need to recover, we need to back off, rather than relying on the lagging indicator, which, as I mentioned earlier, is you get to the end of the day and you're like, wow, I've really overdone it today. Or we don't notice until way too late, and then you've got issues like burnout, for example.
I think there's it's really fascinating. It's really interesting. I think the over reliance on wearable data or performance data in the moment for cyclists, I think there's also a danger of 2 things. One, that you can miss the magic, because sometimes if you're beholden to the numbers, you'll think, well, I can't do any more than that because that's what the numbers are telling me. Whereas we've seen athletes do amazing things where they've probably gone over the numbers because their performance is better than their historicals, right? And if you're constantly looking at the numbers, you're probably not going to push yourself potentially to where you could go to. But I think there's the other thing, not necessarily for elite sport, but for enjoying, exercising. It's actually getting your head up and looking at the beauty that's around you, right? And not having your head stuck in the data. And I think as cyclists, particularly, we can be very focused on a small screen with numbers, missing the forest, the mountains, the lakes that we're riding past, right?
Definitely, yeah. And I've definitely fallen into that trap. I think one of the ways that I got out of that was in my kind of post-racing time. because when I was racing full time, I was riding for a development team for a pro team, and basically that's what I did all day, every day. Was I was either training, racing, or recovering.
Yeah.
And I was very numbers driven. I was a very early adopter of those technologies. And the problem was that when I stopped racing and then went back to university and studied sports science, I knew very well how good I was, and I could quantify that objectively. And every time I went out on my bike, I basically had a very clear sense of how much worse I was getting. And the average power output for a given route was decreasing rapidly. And in the end, I ended up actually walking away from cycling for quite a long time, quite a few years, and ended up gaining quite a lot of unnecessary weight. Some of that associated with university student life. And then when I got back into cycling, made the deliberate choice initially to not use any technology and just do what you described, which was just try and re-find the pleasure in it, because cycling had become so performance orientated for me. I'd actually really at the end of that time completely lost sight of just riding for fun, and just tried to rediscover it. And actually now technology is back part of it again, because I do enjoy that aspect of it. I'm, as you probably picked up, I'm quite a quantitatively orientated character. But I like to try and find that blend, and I do still check in on myself and make sure that, as you said, I'm still kind of looking around, taking the opportunity to kind of smell the roses, metaphorically and sometimes literally, if I'm fortunate enough to be riding by some.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm kind of the same. So as you know, I've had long COVID. I'm now just getting back on the bike. So I'm sort of 9 sessions back in and two out on the road, and my power numbers are kind of a shadow of what they were. In fact, they're so bad that it doesn't even matter, because now it's kind of right. That's my baseline, and all I can see will be improvement now. But the joy of being out there on the open road is again contributing to the 9 out of 10.
Yeah, that's great to hear.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you. I think you've spoken about micro breaks and the Microsoft study, and micro breaks I think are a good way, aren't they, of building recovery into the day for everybody. I mean, I think if we can just build those little bits of thinking space between meetings, that can have a significant effect on our cognitive recovery and performance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's some really interesting research emerging around that. There's some pretty good meta-analytic and evidence and systematic reviews. So grouping together a lot of different papers to be able to figure out what the evidence actually says. And micro breaks are very helpful. I mean, the evidence seems to indicate that they need to be about 10 minutes long, but the more cognitively demanding, the longer the break needs to be. And it seems that the most effective micro breaks have several characteristics. And if I was to synthesize the findings and summarize them, I'd suggest that they've probably got 4 characteristics. There is a relaxing component, and it does seem that it's important that, particularly for knowledge workers, there's a decrease in cognitive load. So there's a drop in the amount of work your brain needs to do. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you need to switch off completely, but it does need to decrease. Ideally, I think there should be an active component. And there's a number of reasons for this, but often when we're knowledge workers, we're sedentary for quite long periods. And so actually getting up, changing posture is good for our musculoskeletal system, which is still one of the leading causes of illness and absence, unfortunately. But that active component, getting around, even doing some light exercise, can also have a really positive effect on our brain. So even a brief bout, so a small amount of aerobic activity, so going for a brisk walk, for example, seems to bias part of our brain called the amygdala, the stress and fear center of the brain, towards feelings of happiness and away from fear. And so the active micro break is really helpful. Ideally, there's also a social component. So interacting with people about non-work related topics really seems to help. And it doesn't even matter if you don't have that interaction in person. So even a phone call with a friend or a loved one, for example, could be helpful. And a lot of people don't like phone calls anymore, but you might be surprised at the benefit. And then the final aspect is that there's a natural aspect to that micro break. And the restorative benefits of seeing natural objects and natural environments is incredible. It relates to this body of research called attention restoration theory. When we see natural objects and patterns, which are often fractals, so things like clouds in the sky, leaves on trees, waves breaking on a beach, it's associated with a unique pattern of brain activity. And that pattern of brain activity is associated with restoration of our attention. So our cognitive performance improves, but also a reduction in stress as well. So if you could have a 10-minute micro break that could incorporate those elements. So, for example, go for a walk with a friend, look at the clouds in the sky. You're going to get that decrease in cognitive load, the relaxing component. It's going to be active, it'll be social, and also natural. And that's what I try to do during my day, and I often recommend that other people do as well.
Yeah, I kind of do that naturally, and the social bit sometimes less so because where I live and work. But yeah, we've got some nice trees, a forest, a wood, a dog walk, that kind of stuff. I try and do that to break the day up. I was also smiling as you were saying that, because aside from the serious risk of lung cancer, what you were describing there is the smoker's break a little bit, right? Which was probably
so funny,
good for our kind of mental recovery, not good for our physical health, of course, but actually in the office environment, that social gathering for 5 minutes with fellows, if we could replicate the smoking break without the smoking, would be great, wouldn't it?
I totally agree. I mean, it's so funny because I did a workshop for quite a broad audience last week, and it was quite interactive. And when I described what I just described then, one of the people actually put their hands up and said, "You'd start smoking with us." And they were serious. There were a couple of smokers in the room. It's so rare now, isn't it, that there are smokers often? But but yeah, it's a shame, isn't it, that it took that. But it's interesting. There was some research that you probably saw as well that suggests that the impact of loneliness can be equivalent to smoking 12 cigarettes a day. Yeah. There's also some other research that suggests that the protective effect of good social relationships is equivalent to the benefit that is conferred by regular physical activity. Yeah. So I do think that that I'm not suggesting, of course, that anybody smokes, but that break where you spent time kind of standing with a group of people and having a chat, you connected with other humans. That social component is so critical to our well-being, and often I think we overlook it, particularly in a society which unfortunately was already quite individualistic. But I think the pandemic, even the shift to remote and home working, has really exacerbated that challenge for many people.
Yeah, well, I think work's become more transactional. We transact work, and we do a lot of transaction over Zoom and Teams. But even back in the office, we're getting through work, and I think we've got to create those moments of connection, be more intentional about creating them. I like that idea, but I think that's where you spark off ideas as well with people, don't you? And you're being creative. Definitely. And it's probably not when you're stuck doing your deep work at your desk. I'm going to ask you an open question in a minute, because I'm asking you leading and closed questions, which is often my style, to my annoyance. But one more really, which has just totally gone out of my head. So I'll ask you the open one first. No, it's come back. Here we go. So there's a lot of good stuff we're talking about here. In your work with organizations, how much do you need to be inspiring people as to the why? I think well-being can often have a view of being this soft, fluffy benefit type issue, or at worst case, it's something to help people when they're broken. How much, you're not really talking about well-being, you're talking about well-being as part of what you do as a performance scientist. When you're talking to organizations, how much convincing as to the why do you need to do?
Yeah, well, I mean, pretty much all of my clients are inbound. So, I don't do a lot of kind of advertising, so to speak. So as a result of that, the people who come to me are kind of someone's already convinced generally, or very open to it. So I find that, with the decision makers, with the people who bring me in to work with them, there's often very little convincing that needs doing. But often what happens is you'll find that within an organization, there is an advocate or a champion or someone who I initially connect with. And sometimes what they want to do is for me to help them to convince other people. This might be other people, the cynics potentially on the leadership team, or maybe in the organization. So yeah, there's definitely part of that kind of internal sales process often that I will help with. And it's a challenge sometimes for people who, I might work in an organization alongside a head of wellbeing, for example. And this isn't the case with all organizations, but I've worked with some where I'll come in and I'll maybe run some sessions for the leadership team. Maybe it'll be an ongoing consulting project around their wellbeing strategy. But often, many of the things I've said, the head of wellbeing has already said. But because I've come in as this external voice, suddenly the people on their team are like, oh, why aren't we thinking about this? And there's a bit kind of, they're like knocking their head on the brick wall. And it's funny, isn't it? Because that unfortunately does happen in organizations where we do sometimes just tune out people when we've heard them say the same thing again and again. A fresh voice has to come in and say the same thing in a slightly different way. And I wish it wasn't like that. But that is a characteristic sometimes of what I end up doing. However, there is also another aspect, which is there's some organizations that do just require a stronger case to be made for example, the connection between well-being and productivity or performance outcomes. And in that case, I might not be saying the same thing. I might be bringing in a different toolkit so that they can actually start to make that case internally. I think one of the challenges with the link between well-being and performance or productivity is performance and productivity means so many different things to so many different people, even within the same organization. So what you often really end up needing to do, if you're going to make that why case, why should you invest in this? You've got to be really clear about what performance and productivity means, what suite of measures you're going to put together in that organization, but also you need to be clear about what well-being means. The way that people often end up approaching it is by using some kind of subjective measure of well-being, which I think can be helpful, and there's some good evidence to show that. At Oxford University, they're doing some quite interesting research on well-being measurement based on this subjective sense of kind of how positive you feel, for example, or how satisfied you are with life. But it's also important to look at other aspects of well-being, in my view. So not just people's psychological sense of well-being, which is often characterized as life satisfaction and what we describe as positive affect, so positive feeling, but also be looking at some of the physiological aspects of well-being. So maybe looking at some of those, again, potentially leading indicators like sleep, which can also be a lagging indicator if it gets messed up because of stress, for example. But also the kind of the psychophysiological resources that people have, maybe with a measure like heart rate variability, for example. But then also be looking at some of the other measures that might provide latent signals of well-being, or the kind of work patterns which we know facilitate or inhibit well-being, like pulling in workplace analytics data, for example, so you can get a sense of how long people are activated for, whether they're taking breaks during the day, but also even things like travel patterns, which you can draw in and understand how many days are people away from home, sleeping in hotels, how many flights are they taking. So I do often need to make that why case, but constructing that why case looks very different depending on the organization. And I do find that people are coming on a journey now. People are a lot further along. I think it's increasingly rare that people say well-being is a waste of time, but I still think it is one of the biggest challenges is that many people still just pay lip service to it, i.e. there's this superficial sense that well-being matters, but that is not backed up by a substantive investment in understanding the inhibitors, also the drivers of well-being, and in the context of a well-being strategy that's really integrated with their business strategy. So there's still positive signals, but still a long way to go.
Yeah. Do you think we're heading for that kind of watershed moment where there'll be a tipping point of more organizations really start to understand the benefits of looking at this more seriously?
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a number of drivers for this. I mean, there's data that indicate that well-being is becoming an increasingly important factor in people's decision-making about where they're going to work and if they're going to stay. And so there was quite a well-publicized statistic which suggests that I think about 60% of people would consider moving to a different employer that took better care of their well-being, even if they were paid less. So I think well-being, people are recognizing that well-being needs to be an increasingly important part of their employee value proposition. But I think also people are recognizing that well-being isn't just something that we do, it's actually ideally an outcome as well as a driver of other outcomes.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, people are looking at recognizing that the balance between effort and recovery, their work demands, their ways of working, their culture are either facilitating or inhibiting well-being. And actually, if they can move the needle on well-being, that can really influence business outcomes.
Yeah.
And again, we're seeing some evidence to suggest that. So I do think we're at this tipping point where people are starting to see that, as you kind of alluded to, well-being isn't just this fluffy thing that's maybe somewhere around benefits. It's actually about human potential.
Yeah.
Some people are talking about human capacity. Other people are talking about human sustainability.
Yeah.
And I actually think that the consulting firms that are often using some of this language are playing quite a big role in that, because often this change happens within big organizations. An HBR article gets written and then it kind of filters down. And I think many of these consulting firms are starting to try and package on well-being offers alongside other projects that they're doing, which is probably playing quite a big role in starting to shift some of these expectations and the awareness of what's possible within these organizations, because there's a commercial driver behind it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think we are at a tipping point. There's a lot of positive change coming, I think, but it's there's still a long way to go. We're definitely not there yet. And I think the data around people's perception of how they feel about their well-being and some of the gaps between that and maybe what leaders think is going on is one example of how far we've got to go.
For sure, 100%. I agree. My open question now. So, looking to the future of well-being, what's on your mind? What studies would you point to? What are you thinking about? Kind of what that is going to look like.
So, I think for me, one of the most critical aspects of the future of well-being is that it involves this comprehensive approach that addresses the root causes of poor well-being. We can't just keep attaching on more and more interventions and different services if the underlying system is broken. And I think part of that means we've got to shift from what I describe as a legacy mindset, which was about kind of well-being as this adjunct, like this separate thing, into something that's fully integrated with business strategy and that also has got accountability at the appropriate level. And by that, I mean that, well-being, people aren't just accountable for well-being, as a KPI for the kind of head of HR. It's actually a fundamental KPI in the business that the most senior leaders are accountable for. I also think the future of well-being is going to be hopefully characterized by measuring well-being in a meaningful way. And that means, I think, combining both qualitative and quantitative data, which, I kind of hinted at in some of the earlier things that we've spoken about. And I think if we can do that, if we can use the appropriate qualitative and quantitative data in the right way, then we can start to identify and prioritize the areas that can have the greatest impact. Because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that I see kind of with this legacy way of thinking is that, often what used to happen is, a senior leader has a positive experience of a particular intervention. I don't want to fixate on meditation. I often use this example. I think meditation can be helpful for many people, but I've seen so many times that a senior leader has a positive experience of meditation. Next morning comes in, calls up the head of wellbeing or head of HR, whoever's responsible, and says, meditation has changed my life. Do something about it. So the head of HR says, I need to do something about meditation then. They do a Google search, and before you know it, they've got a kind of B2B annual subscription for everybody to one of the well-known kind of app-based meditation providers. They roll that out for a few months, and then they say, what's going on? But the problem is it all happened so quickly and it all happened so top down that no one actually took a measurement at the beginning. No one actually even figured out what they were trying to improve as a result of doing some kind of meditation intervention. And so that's an example of where I think we need to start by understanding the key areas that need to be addressed, the things that might have the greatest impact, how we're going to measure the efficacy of those, so that we can actually construct wellbeing strategies that can continue to improve, that aren't just based on sometimes faulty intuition. And it's one of the things that I work on quite a lot with organizations is trying to put together that measurement toolkit so that then when they bring in different providers and different tools, they've got a system to actually understand what's working and what's not. So, I think, if we can do that in the future of wellbeing, we're going to be in a much better place.
Yeah.
And I think, there's really three aspects that I'd consider in that context. It's going to be about influencing leadership behaviors. It's going to be influencing the design of work, and it's going to be influencing ways of working. And that might involve some of these tools, some apps, but it's thinking about these things at a more fundamental and more integrated level.
Yeah.
I also think it's about creating systems and structures that eliminate obstacles for well-being. I think, again, so often we think about what we can add, but in my view, the future of well-being might be as much about what we can actually take away, what needs to be taken away.
Meetings are a good example of that, right?
Oh, absolutely. And there was a great study that was published in HBR where they suggested that reducing the number of meetings by, I think it was 26%, actually meaningfully improved productivity and performance in the organization. And alongside that, there's this great flowchart which it shows it suggests when you actually need a meeting.
Yeah.
And it's such a great tool because some Microsoft data suggests that the number of meetings year on year has increased by over 150%. And so many meetings that I've been part of could have been replaced with a single well-worded email.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the simplest things that many people could do is just send around that flowchart so people do this self-check to figure out whether they really need a meeting. I mean, there's another aspect to meetings as well. And again, it's a little bit of a tangent, but sometimes I think, particularly with more junior employees, they feel there's a need for a meeting because they're not experiencing the psychological safety that's required to actually make those decisions or do that work on their own. Yeah. And so, again, the flowchart can be helpful, but actually we also need to ask the question as leaders, have we got too many meetings because we're not actually empowering our teams enough to be able to do the work independently? But ultimately, I think the future of wellbeing is where we see wellbeing as an outcome of addressing some of these more systematic issues, and then also as an enabler for productivity and performance. Yeah. There's some of my thoughts on maybe what the future of wellbeing could look like.
Yeah, really good to hear, and good validation for me in terms of how we've built FormScore to try and assist with some of those challenges and opportunities. So thank you for sharing that. So scientifically, time is taking on very strange properties today, James. It's our time is almost up. It has actually evaporated while we've been chatting, which is a sign of a good conversation. But I'd asked you to choose a bit of mood boosting music, a track that works for you in boosting your mood, and you chose Aerodynamic by Daft Punk. Just talk me through why that track is meaningful for you and why it's a mood booster for you.
Yeah, so that track, I listened to it a lot in the early 2000s on my mini disc player, which tells you how early that was. Because I think it was like 2001, I think, when that track came out when I was cycling, and I was in the south of France, and I was a young guy just with complete freedom riding my bike in the Pyrenees, and so whenever I hear that track, it takes me back to that time, where I was super fit and fast and having fun riding my bike and racing it in the Pyrenees. But also, I just think it's such an interesting piece of music because it's got such a strange combination of samples. It starts off with church bells. You've got a kind of rock baroque guitar solo in there. You've obviously got the kind of the French house aspect to it as well, which Daft Punk is best known for, and it somehow mixes all together and it works. So I guess philosophically, I like, there's something that resonates with me there, this idea that sometimes, something that feels like it shouldn't work, that feels disconnected. And sometimes I feel like, life feels a bit like that, can come together and create something fantastic. And so there's a positive message there, I think, for me. I just think it's a great track. I think obviously it evokes those memories, and I'm generally, an EDM fan and Daft Punk fan. So it ticks all those boxes for me.
Yeah, brilliant. It's a great choice. I was reflecting that it was that album and that track that were very meaningful for me in that time, but I was more of a hedonist in those days, owning bars in London, hadn't discovered cycling, and it was a very different time. And I think that's the really interesting thing about music. You can be connected by music in very different kind of life stages or experiences. So let's play a little segment of it just so we can give our listeners a sense of what it's all about. Such a great choice, James. Thank you for sharing that. It's a complete banger. But I think, the genius of Daft Punk, right, in being able to bring so many different elements, as you say, that probably shouldn't work together, that then create something much more. And I think, we can use that analogy with our well-being, can't we? That actually we put all of this together, and it can kind of harmonize for us and end up in flow state.
Definitely.
So the science of music and our mental health and well-being, as you know, I've put a whole performance together around this. But what's your view as a performance scientist on the benefits of music on our brain?
Oh, there's tons. I mean, I think I've written some stuff about this before, summarizing some of the research. I mean, generally, it seems that cognitive work, we generally don't want music with lyrics. But there's several different boxes you need to tick. But if you do that, I think music can be really beneficial to many different types of work. It can also help us to relax. There's obviously that adaptive positive component. It can improve physical performance too. I summarized the results of a study a few days ago where they found that in particular fast tempo music can actually improve average power output in endurance sport. So I think the effects of music on our physiology, our psychology, our underlying cognitive capabilities, really just astounding. And it's an area I find fascinating. One of the reasons I'm really interested in what you do, Rob, because I just think there's so much potential there for music, just for enjoyment, but also as an intervention. If you want get scientific about it.
What I'm finding with it is that because music is such a great connector, most of us have a relationship with music. To actually draw people into an event that is fundamentally about mental health and well-being through the power of music, you're getting a whole different subset of people that are coming in. And so for workplaces, a lot of feedback we're getting is we're reaching people that we haven't reached before, and we're getting them to think about their well-being and mental health, as well as all the intervention type benefits. So it's something I'm going to keep plugging away at. So quick fire round, something I haven't asked you to prepare for, James. If the future of well-being were a colour, what would the colour be for you?
Blue.
Why blue?
I don't know. It's the first colour that came into my head. I think if I wanted to kind of come up with a rationale for that, I think it would be that I'm really fond of this metaphor for life, described as the sailboat metaphor, which is developed by a psychologist called Dr. Scott Barry Kaufman. And so he's kind of rethought Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which sometimes unhelpfully is described as a pyramid. And actually he characterizes life more as this kind of journey that we sail over or through on an ocean. And there's different aspects of these kind of fundamental needs which support that journey and facilitate it. And so maybe it's blue because I think about the freedom of the ocean and the sky, and the fact that actually we're kind of on this journey together. Because when I say blue, I'm thinking of it in that context rather than kind of blue as in down. It's more about that kind of journey and those natural elements.
I love that, and I love the idea of the journey and doing it together as well. That's very good. If the future of well-being were a food, what would it be?
It'd be some green leafy vegetable, probably. Just because that's so boring, but we know that fiber is so good for our microbiome and all that kind of stuff. I wish it was pizza, because I absolutely love pizza. And maybe the future of well-being is pizza, actually, and maybe I can change my answer, because it's something that you enjoy together. You cut those slices up and you sit around and you have a good time. So actually I changed that. Forget the green leafy vegetables. The future of well-being is pizza.
I'll tell you what I'll do for you, right? We'll have some green leafy vegetable on the pizza as well in this particular case. We'll get a bit of rocket on there, just as a nod to the health. I agree with you on pizza. That would be my answer to that question, the different components that make it up. If the future of well-being were an animal, what springs to mind?
Oh, I think it would have to be some kind of cat. And the dog lovers will hate that. I like dogs as well. But the reason I say cat is that we're going to require agility in the future of well-being. I think that's one of its characteristics, is that we're going to have to be adaptable to make sure we individualize. So we account for all the different kind of ways of working, preferences, work and lifestyles. And for me, kind of, a cat is agile. It's able to respond to all kinds of different conditions. You look at what happens when it jumps out of a tree. It can flip around and it'll land on its feet. And hopefully that agility, that resilience, but also some kind of friendly playfulness as well, is what will characterize the future of well-being.
I like it. And then final one. If the future of well-being were a place, where would that place be for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think it would probably be a beach,
Yeah.
because it would be a place where you kind of, again, ideally it's there's some powerful forces coming together, but in a way that actually is positive, is a net positive. And where you've kind of got, on one hand, the sea, again, full of opportunity, but also risk. You've got the beach, which can be quite difficult to walk along, but is also a great place to relax. And I think that's probably what the future of wellbeing is going to be like. It's not going to be super easy all the time. There's going to be all these kind of tensions, but ideally we can bring it together, and it'll be a place that, again, people can gather, is going to support them, and hopefully it will be a positive, sunny experience for everyone.
Amazing. Yeah, love it. That's a great picture I've built up there. So thank you for sharing. James, we'll put a link to your amazing newsletter. I'd recommend people sign up to that to get a good dose of science and interesting perspectives. Thank you so much. Your perspectives and this discussion has been really enjoyable. I've loved talking to you. This is the Future of Wellbeing with me, Rob Stevenson, and thank you to you, James.
Thank you.